Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is June 16th. On this day in 1964, white supremacists in Neshoba County, Mississippi, firebombed and burned Mount Zion Methodist Church, a black congregation in the rural Longdale community. But this wasn't just an act of intimidation, it was part of a larger effort to stamp out civil rights organizing, and it would lead directly to one of the most infamous crimes of the civil rights era: the murders of James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, also known as the Mississippi Burning Murders. But what a lot of people don't know is that all began here, with a church, a community, and a campaign for justice. Today, we're going to look back at the attack on Mount Zion Church, the civil rights work that made it a target, and how this night of violence set a deadly chain of events in motion. Let's get started. Mount Zion Methodist Church has long been more than a church. Like so many black churches across the South, it was also a meeting space, a school, and during the civil rights era, a safe haven. It was a place where people gathered not only to pray, but to organize. In early 1964, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, began working with Mount Zion's congregation to prepare for Freedom Summer. The idea for Freedom Summer was simple but revolutionary. They were going to teach black citizens about their voting rights and help them register in a state where voter suppression was written into law and enforced through violence. Michael Schwerner, a young white CORE worker from New York, was one of the organizers leading the effort. Alongside him was James Cheney, a local black activist from Meridian, Mississippi. The two had helped arrange for Mount Zion to host a freedom school, one of many planned that summer to empower black youth and adults with knowledge and tools for change. But of course, not everyone in Mississippi saw this as empowerment. To the Ku Klux Klan, this was an invasion. Schwerner's activism and the church's growing involvement had made Mount Zion a target. June 16, 1964 was a sweltering Tuesday in Neshoba County. Earlier that day, Mount Zion's congregation had met to talk about the upcoming Freedom School. These were just ordinary people. They were mothers, grandfathers, farmers, all gathering in hope. They had no idea what was to come. That evening, around dusk, a group of Klansmen, some of whom were also local law enforcement officers, drove in a convoy to Mount Zion. Their goal was not just to intimidate, it was to find and punish Mickey Schwerner, who they believed had radicalized the church. But he wasn't there. Instead, the Klansmen found several church members leaving a meeting. Among them were elders and just regular parishioners, none of whom were civil rights workers themselves, but all of whom had dared to support the movement. The Klansmen pulled them from their cars and interrogated them. When the congregants refused to say where Schwerner was, the situation escalated. Several church members were brutally beaten. One man was reportedly kicked unconscious. Another suffered broken ribs. It was an unmistakable message. Don't align yourself with civil rights workers. Don't question the social order. Don't resist. Then, the Klansmen set fire to the church. Using kerosene or gasoline, they firebombed the building, engulfing it in flames. The wooden structure burned quickly, and the steeple collapsed into a pile of charred rubble. By the time the fire died down, Mount Zion Methodist Church was gone. For the Longdale community, the loss of Mount Zion was more than physical, it was psychological. The Klan had destroyed not only a sacred space, but a cornerstone of black life in Neshoba County. And it was meant to send a message: organizing will not be tolerated. But the Klan miscalculated. Instead of snuffing out resistance, the burning of Mount Zion became a rallying cry. Rather than silence the movement, the attack galvanized CORE and other civil rights groups. The beating of elderly church members and the destruction of a house of worship drew national attention. When CORE got wind of the attack, Michael Schwerner, James Cheney, and a newly arrived volunteer, Andrew Goodman, decided that they had to go to Neshoba County. They wanted to check on the community, talk to local leaders, and assess the damage. On June 21st, they arrived in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and visited the remains of Mount Zion. That afternoon, they were stopped by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, one of the men who had helped orchestrate the attack. He arrested them on a trumped-up traffic violation and held them in jail until after dark. What happened next was horrifying. After their release around 10 p.m., the three young men were followed, ambushed, and murdered by a group of Klansmen. Their bodies were buried in an earthen dam and wouldn't be discovered for 44 agonizing days. That moment, the disappearance and murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner brought national media, federal investigators, and a firestorm of outrage. It would become one of the most infamous crimes of the civil rights era. But that chain of events began with a church, a fire, and a community that had dared to hope for change. Mount Zion Methodist Church was rebuilt later that year. No one was ever charged for the arson or the beatings that night, but the attack on the church was cited in the federal prosecution that eventually brought partial justice for the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The people of Mount Zion didn't fold under fear. They continued their work, continued to worship, and continued to believe in the promise of justice. And while the world remembers the Mississippi burning case, it's important to also remember what sparked it: a burning church and the people who refused to let that fire be the end of their story. On June 16, 1964, a group of white supremacists tried to silence a community by setting a church on fire. But what they ignited instead was a movement, one that drew national attention to the deep violence and racism embedded in the South and directly led to change. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!